Welcome to the Green Utility webcast. My name is Michael Burr, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Public Utilities Fortnightly magazine. Today we're talking about Arizona Public Service and their approach to renewable energy. And on the line with me is our contributing editor, Steve Anderson. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Michael.
So different utilities approach renewable energy in different ways. Some seem to view it primarily as a compliance obligation, and others look at it as really an investment opportunity, really even as a rate-based investment opportunity. And the difference seems to depend on what state the utility is in. I gather that Arizona doesn't necessarily fit into this stereotype.
Yeah, Arizona is kind of an interesting case. They seem to have everybody on the same page between their Public Utility Commission, which is called a corporation commission down there, and the legislature and the utilities. They all seem to be squarely behind the effort to invest in renewables, and not just for straight compliance reasons.
Well, so let's dig into that a little bit. Arizona has a renewable portfolio standard.
Right.
So what is it about APS that makes this story about anything other than just simply how a utility is meeting its compliance obligations?
Yeah, their renewable standard there is called the Renewable Energy Standard, an RES. And I'll let my source, Brad Albert, who is the general manager for energy resource acquisition and renewable energy at APS, speak to that question directly.
The RES standard really sets the floor, if you will, in terms of the renewable energy standards. But really, through our resource planning process, we looked at a couple of other factors that we thought were important in the long term, such as price stability type aspects that renewable energy brings, and energy source diversity. We actually are on a trajectory to sort of substantially exceed that RES standard.
And in fact, they're planning on exceeding that standard, not just by a little bit, but doubling it or more by 2015. I think their standard would call for 5% to be renewables by 2015. They're expecting 10 to 11% to be online by that point.
Interesting. So I guess I'm wondering then, what does that mean for rates? How are they going to get a rate case through the Arizona Corporation Commission to invest beyond what the Renewable Energy Standard is actually requiring them to do?
Yeah, I asked him about that, and he said that they haven't had any friction. Now, it was a little bit hard to pin him down on exactly how much of a premium they're paying for renewable energy, but on some material that they've made public previously, it's about 20% more than traditional generation sources. When you factor that in at this point of only about 5% of their energy mix, it's not going to have a huge rate impact on this at this point. It could conceivably down the road, but there's a lot of other variables in play as this stuff becomes a bigger part of the grid.
I see. Okay. Well, 20% seems like actually a pretty low premium, but that depends on the basis for comparison, right? So I'm wondering how the outlook for renewable energy in Arizona stacks up against APS's other resource options.
Well, what they have right now currently is about 40% coal generation, a little less than 30%, I think 27% nuclear, about 30% gas. The rest is renewables. But I'll also let Brad Albert speak directly to that point.
What we really use as a source of comparison is natural gas generation, because we don't intend to build any new coal-fired generation, nor in the next 15 years do we see ourselves building new nuclear generation. So our incremental conventional generating sources in the next 15 years are natural gas-based.
So the real interesting point there is that they're using gas prices as their yardstick. If they're only going to be bringing gas-fired resources online in the next 15 years, that means that they're pegged to one cost. They're at around $4 MMBTU right now. That was as much as $13 just a couple of years ago. So if you have all your eggs in that basket, the value proposition could shift dramatically in a short period of time. So having more solar on the grid, having more of an energy resource mix is going to lead to price stability. At least that's what they're betting on.
Right. Okay. So they're somewhat worried about price volatility and trying to balance that
Absolutely.
out with some renewable options. So, what renewable approaches seem to make the most sense for APS? You know, when we think of Arizona, we think of a lot of sunshine. Is that pretty much the only game in town for APS?
It's not, but it's definitely the most promising one. They actually have a fairly diverse mix of renewables on their grid. Most of that is through PPAs. They have a contract with a geothermal plant in Eastern California. They have wind farms in northern New Mexico, Arizona as well. But the bulk of it is solar. Some of that's big utility scale stuff. Some of it's distributed. Some of it is solar concentrating, thermal. And of course, quite a bit is PV. Photovoltaics are the big thing that they see as having the best potential for price parity down the road. And I think that's where they're pouring most of their resources now.
So when you say they're putting their resources into it, are they investing directly as a utility rate base kind of development, or are they mostly relying on PPAs?
Both, and they're just beginning to build a 100 megawatt utility-owned PV utility scale plant. That is the first one of that scale. Everything else that they have that's a sizable, solar farm is PPA. They've got a massive one that's a solar concentrating plant that is a partnership with a Spanish company. And They also have a lot of distributed energy around the grid. It's a small percentage now, but it's growing. And one of the interesting facets of the Arizona renewable energy standard is that it actually requires 30% of that to be distributed generation.
So when utilities invest in solar plants, they tend to invest in large solar arrays, basically out in the desert. But from what I hear you saying, Arizona Public Service actually sees some opportunity in distributed solar around the grid. Is that right?
Yeah, and they're doing it in kind of an interesting way. A lot of times, utilities tend to balk at the distributed generation, and even see it as a type of competition. But Arizona Public Service is doing something interesting in that they're actually owning some of these distributed resources. Whether both commercial and residential customers have the option to do utility-owned installation, so they don't have to take that initial investment to install their solar panels or to maintain them. And that is it's an interesting business model, and it's one that I'm always wonder why more people don't explore it, because it seems to have a lot of potential at this point.
Interesting. Okay. Well, it sounds like a red state utility is going green.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered it, Steve. Thanks very much for your time.
All right.
Cheers.
Bye bye.